My thesis was on the topic of the popular writings of First World War soldiers in Italy that they exchanged with their family members. I really focused on the letters and the cards that they exchanged with their wives and their mothers when they were on the front, and how their communications with their families really made a difference to their mental health while they were on the front, and how the words that they expressed to their close family members really portrayed how they felt about the war and their impressions of what was going on around them at the front. Really interesting kind of context to my thesis is that I started out with a completely different topic. So on our first day of the program, when we had to kind of brainstorm ideas that we might want to explore for our thesis, I was interested in the First World War, but I was in a completely different country. I wanted to focus on Germany, and I wanted to study prisoners of war in the camps there and kind of what their experience was like and why it hadn't been studied that often. But I quickly realized that it's really important to write about what you know. And although I had a really great interest in Germany, I did not know the German language, and I did not know as much about German history as I did about Italian history. So our program advisors, as well as the professor who would become my thesis advisor, really suggested that I focus on Italy because it was a country that I had studied in classes at Columbia and also in my undergraduate experience. And it was also a language that I've been taking for a long time, so it would make it really interesting to study the primary sources in the Italian language. My thesis took a while to develop. I really kind of took it one step at a time, listening to suggestions from different professors on what they thought, listening to my advisor, Professor Berghan, and also just collecting a lot of secondary source information. I originally, once I settled on Italy in the First World War, wanted to look at soldiers on the front and their political views and how they would later become future fascist. So I really wanted to approach it from a political angle and how it affected the regime construction of Mussolini and the fascists in the 1920s. But as I was progressing on my thesis, I found that I really was more interested in anthropology and sociology than I was in political science. And I thought it was really interesting that the bulk of the evidence about the First World War in Italy was related to letters and postcards that they exchanged with their family. So I decided instead to switch to a topic that studied the Scrittura Popolare, which is the popular writings that they exchanged with their family members, and how it affected their mental health and how it showed either their well-adjustment towards the war or how it showed signs of shell shock, or what we would now call PTSD. So with my kind of process for the thesis, a big bulk of it, many months, was collecting secondary source information. And then once I decided what primary source information I wanted to use, it became necessary to travel to Italy to collect that information. I really kind of debated for a long time over what kind of primary source documents would be best. But at the end of the day, I really thought letters and postcards would be an interesting way to look at this relationship. Although many scholars in Italy have looked at these before, there's a lot of great archival institutions in Italy that study this. There hasn't been that much written in the English language and from an American perspective, so I thought it'd be interesting to do so. Once I decided upon letters and cards as my primary source information, I reached out to different archives in Italy, and I used recommendations from librarians at Butler Library here at Columbia, as well as my advisor, Professor Berghan, and other professors at Columbia, as to which archive would be the best to go to. I ended up deciding upon the archive in Genoa, Italy, which focuses specifically on Scrittura Popolare, the popular writings, and I really was extremely grateful to receive a travel grant from Columbia in order to go to Italy. I collected a lot of research here in New York over the summer. And then right before I started writing my thesis, in early September, I traveled to Italy. I spent about 10 days or so in Genoa, and I met with the professors there at the archive who were amazing. They gave me letters and postcards that I was able to read into and kind of see the actual words that these soldiers were writing to their family members, especially their wives and their mothers. I took a ton of photos and was able to collect a lot of information about these documents. And then when I came back to Columbia, it actually was a pretty easy process to write because I already had tons of information and already had a general outline of where I saw my project going. So it was all a matter of just piecing it together. So for about 3-4 months, I wrote it. I rewrote it again and then rewrote it a couple more times. And it really was just a process of working with my advisor, Professor Berghan, to edit it and make sure I was getting my point across clearly. It was really sensitive dealing with primary source documents of this nature because most of them are in Italian. Most of them had not been translated, so I wanted to make sure that I was really getting the authentic nature of the letters across and I wasn't portraying the soldiers and their words in an authentic way. So that was kind of the whole process of my thesis from start to finish. I started out with a general idea, and it was months and months of collecting secondary source information and talking to advisors that guided me to my final idea. And even as I was writing my thesis, my thoughts were changing about what these soldiers were trying to say and what the First World War meant to them. So it wasn't until my final product of my thesis was produced that I felt like I decided on exactly what my opinion was towards these soldiers and their writings exchanged with their family members. And for me, it was a real honor to do so because in Italy, the First World War is very important to them because it was Italy's first participation in a European war campaign of this kind after becoming a unified country in the 1860s and 1870s. So it means a lot to them, and they want to protect the legacy of the war in a very special way, especially now that it's 100 years later after the end of the First World War. So I wanted to make sure that I transmitted the message of the letters and the cards in a really meaningful way. And I wanted to make sure that this was transmitted to a wider audience outside of Italy. So hopefully that students in the US and elsewhere can read this in English and understand what the soldiers were trying to say about their experience.